Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're doing something, well, honestly, it's truly fascinating. We're going to unpack a single, highly tense piece of visual art, a study we're calling Forge Aratit Erotica. Our goal here is to deconstruct exactly how things like composition, perspective, and some seriously heavy texture all combine to create a palpable psychological narrative right before our eyes. Okay, let's dive right in by looking at the actual source directive that birthed this artwork. The prompt asks for, quote, a cinematic, high-tension shot focusing on the raw emotion and the illicit nature of the moment. Instantly, that sets a very specific stage, doesn't it? We aren't just looking at a standard portrait. We're dropping right into a dark, domestic, and intensely illicit mood where literally every visual choice is designed to make us feel something deeply specific. Take a really close look at this baseline image. Notice how it just completely phrases a cinematic moment of high stakes and raw vulnerability right in front of us. The woman is kneeling, looking up, and there's this heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere. It's a snapshot of a moment where everything hangs in the balance, and we are placed right in the middle of it. Section 1. The Tension Triangle. So to really grasp this narrative, we've got to look at three competing psychological forces at play here. In the foreground, we see the submissive subject, locked in a forced, deeply private act of submission. But contrasting heavily in the background is the impending intruder, the threat of an immediate, dangerous interruption. It's a literal push and pull between the secret happening right now and the terrifying consequence that's about to burst through the door. Moving on to Section 2, the voyeur's lens. Now, the source text actually defines this scene as being captured from the perspective of a classic handheld 90s camcorder. By placing a dominant hand just at the edge of the frame, gripping the subject, the composition effectively turns you, yes, you, the viewer, into the active participant holding that very camera. You aren't just floating in the ether anymore, you are looking down through the lens. And just look at those wide, glistening eyes and that flushed face. The fact that she is looking directly into the lens forces a deep, deep discomfort on our end. It basically demands that we acknowledge our voyeuristic complicity in this scene of forced embarrassment. Section 3. Thick impasto, heavy tension. Now this is where it gets really interesting. There's this wild juxtaposition between that digital camcorder prompt we just talked about and how the aesthetic actually manifested. Instead of a flat, grainy VHS image, which is what you might expect, right? The artwork employs this oil-drawn painting aesthetic. These heavy impasto brushstrokes create a physical, almost suffocating textural weight on the canvas. It makes the emotional weight of the scene feel physically real and intensely claustrophobic. If we compare these iterations side by side, it's just mind-blowing how powerful this medium is. On the left, iteration A shows subtle textural shifts. But look over at iteration B on the right. Notice how the heavy, sculpted texture in her hollowed cheeks, the glistening sweat on her skin, and those rigid folds of her dress add a literal, suffocating layer of tension to the piece. The paint itself feels like it's trapping her in this moment. Section 4. The shadow at the door. But wait, the tension isn't just happening between the subject and us, the viewer. Look at that third, frankly terrifying element lurking in the blurred background. Right there, through the frosted glass panel of the shut bedroom door, the silhouette of a man appears as if he's knocking. This is an absolute masterstroke of composition. It introduces a high-stakes ticking clock to this whole scenario. The act isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening seconds away from discovery. And we can't ignore the lighting. This moody, dimly lit domestic setup plays a critical role here, wrapping the entire bedroom in shadow and leaving only the subject fully illuminated. This deliberately amplifies the terror of that impending discovery. The light draws our eye right to the illicit act, while the shadows hide the immediate consequence just outside. Look at how even the tiniest original replica shifts in the silhouette's hand and posture completely change the narrative weight. On the left, the hand is spread. Perhaps he's just arriving. But on the right, the posture seems more pressing, a lot more urgent. These tiny compositional shifts manipulate our perception of just how imminent the danger really is. Section 5. Forging Arete Erotica. So what's the big takeaway? When all of these elements synthesize, we see a true masterclass in forging arete erotica, an absolute excellence of psychological tension. The image works by flawlessly executing a three-step trap. Step 1. Establish forced, conflicted submission in the foreground. Step 2. Implicate the viewer directly via the camera lens and that dominant hand. And Step 3. Introduce an immediate external threat in the background. It basically locks the viewer in a continuous state of high-stakes suspense and implicit mystery. Which really leaves us with a deeply provocative final thought about our own role in this visual narrative. As the viewer of this illicit moment, are we merely observing the tension, or does our gaze make us complicit in the intrusion? In consuming this artwork, are we just bystanders catching a glimpse, or are we effectively the architects of this psychological trap? It's a fantastic question to ponder as we deconstruct how art makes us feel. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this completely shifts how you look at the hidden architecture of visual tension.
Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because, honestly, we're looking at something incredibly fascinating. We are going to completely deconstruct a highly specific, undeniably tension-filled piece of AI art generation. We're looking at a thematic style often referred to within AI communities as forge arete erotica. Our goal today? We're going to see exactly how complex, deeply layered, and frankly, kind of bizarre text prompts translate into striking, fully realized visuals. We're going to break down the whole shebang. The lighting, the mood, the rendering of emotion, and those wild stylistic contradictions that the AI produces.
Okay, let's dive into this. A cinematic, high-tension shot captured from the perspective of a handheld 90s camcorder. That is the very first line of the prompt fed into the AI, and it immediately plunges us right into the raw, visceral, intended mood of the source material. The creator isn't just asking for a picture of a room, right? They're dictating the exact medium, the era, and the psychological weight of the lens itself. They're basically asking the AI to simulate the gritty, unpolished reality of 1990s home video, setting a stage that is instantly recognizable and, well, deeply intrusive.
And boom, here's how that baseline instruction begins to manifest. We are dropped right into the intense, claustrophobic atmosphere of the scene. If you look closely at the woman's face, the AI has perfectly captured this sense of raw emotion and the highly illicit nature of the moment. The lighting is exactly what the prompt asked for, moody and domestic. It feels like a moment that was never meant to be captured, frozen in time by this subjective, voyeuristic lens. The AI is doing exactly what it was told, generating undeniable domestic tension.
Section 1, the cinematic setup. And this brilliantly illustrates what we were just talking about. Notice that high-angle perspective mimicking that subjective 90s camcorder point of view. But look at the top right corner. The man is partially out of frame, yet his dominant presence is heavily felt through the angle of the shot and the thick, textured rendering of his hand gripping her hair. By keeping the person holding the camera largely unseen, the AI creates an immediate sense of illicit vulnerability. We, the viewers, are essentially forced into the perspective of the dominant figure, which drastically alters how we consume the image. Section 2. Rendering conflicted emotions.
Okay, so here are the exact phrases used in the prompt to dictate her emotional state. We have conflicted pleasure and forced embarrassment right alongside physical descriptors like wide glistening eyes, flushed face. But then we see these totally mashed up algorithmic trigger words, LollingMonsterGutteral and SluttyTabooStruggling. Objectively analyzing this as technical AI prompt engineering, these intense boundary-pushing terms are specifically designed to break the AI out of its default, perfectly posed portrait mode. They force the neural network to pull from highly specific, charged data sets to achieve a very precise, conflicted emotional state that perfectly balances panic, exertion, and submission.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the AI interprets those exact same words across different iterations. On the left and the right, we have subtle variations generated from the exact same prompt. Guide your eye to the micro-observations here. Look at the glisten in the eyes, which changes just slightly in intensity. Notice the slight shifts in the hollowed cheeks as she supposedly struggles with the depth, just as the prompt requested. The AI is constantly recalculating. It's like a giant puzzle, figuring out how to map those strange trigger words onto human anatomy, resulting in these fascinating, minute shifts between panic and pleasure in every single render. Section 3, suspense in the background.
So the crucial point is how this image operates on two entirely different genre frequencies at the exact same time. On the left side of our breakdown, we have elements of erotica and submission, the kneeling subject, the dominant hand, the illicit intimacy of the camcorder. But on the right side, the prompt specifically injects classic horror and suspense thriller elements, a dimly lit bedroom, a blurred background, and most importantly, a shadowy silhouette knocking at the door. The AI seamlessly blends these two genres, elevating the whole thing from a simple taboo scene into a moment of incredibly high psychological tension.
Let's look really closely at that visual storytelling in the background. In both of these iterations, you can see the blurred bedroom door shut tight, with the silhouette of a man visible through the frosted glass panel. The prompt explicitly asked for him to look as if knocking. In the version on the left, his hand is raised, fingers splayed against the glass. On the right, his posture is slightly different, looming a bit closer. The AI handles the depth of field beautifully here, keeping him out of focus to add a suffocating layer of imminent danger. It's like time is literally running out for the characters in the foreground, and that blurred figure represents an impending collision of their secret world with the outside reality.
Section 4. Iterations of Style. Let's move to and see how this builds our overall understanding of the Forgeretti erotica style. We are looking at the effects of concepts like oil-drawn painting and darker, thicker filled. This is a stylistic enhancement utilizing thick, textured, dark impasto strokes. And if you aren't familiar, impasto is a technique where paint is laid on an area of the surface very thickly, usually thick enough that the brush or painting knife strokes are actually visible. The AI has applied this to give the digital image a heavy, physical, and almost gothic weight. It literally makes the digital file feel like a tactile, centuries-old artifact. But looking at this specific rendering, you'll see a fascinating contradiction. The text prompt specifically called for a slight, grainy VHS texture to match that 90s camcorder aesthetic, right? But the AI, likely influenced by the heavier stylistic modifiers, renders the scene with classical, thick oil paints. You can literally see the three-dimensional ridges of the paint on her skin and the wooden floorboards. It creates a wholly unique visual synthesis, a modern, technological concept of a VHS tape rendered in the analog, historical medium of oil paint. It's a totally fascinating misinterpretation by the AI that actually elevates the final image.
Which brings us to our final thought for today's explainer. When we look at these generations, we really have to ask ourselves, how does blending analog concepts like 90s camcorders with classical mediums like thick oil paints, all generated by a cutting-edge artificial intelligence, change our perception of illicit media? Does the classical painting style legitimize the taboo subject matter? Does the 90s camcorder framing make a classical painting feel intrusive? The tension in this artwork isn't just in the narrative of the characters, it's baked into the very DNA of how the image was constructed. It leaves us with a lot to think about regarding the future intersections of AI, art, and suspense. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and I highly encourage you to keep looking closely at the art generated around you.
Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we are stepping into a seriously fascinating and honestly a highly specific visual space. In this explainer, we're going to do a deep dive into an incredibly intense, almost claustrophobic scene of digital art. We'll be breaking down exactly how specific textual commands, words and phrases engineered for maximum psychological impact, translate into a visceral visual masterpiece. If you're fascinated by the intersection of language, art, and raw human emotion, you are in the exact right place. Okay, just listen to this. A cinematic, high-tension shot captured from the perspective of a handheld 90s camcorder. In a dimly lit bedroom, a beautiful woman with an expression of conflicted pleasure and forced embarrassment is kneeling on the floor. Right? Let those words sink in for a second. This isn't just a basic description. It literally reads like the cold open of a gripping erotic thriller. It sets a scene that is immediately invasive, highly charged, and undeniably tense. We're just thrust right into the middle of a story, asked to witness a moment that feels both entirely private and dangerously exposed. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, Forging Arete Erotica, the thematic engine. So to really get what we're looking at throughout these images, we have to explore our foundational concept first, which is Forge Arete Erotica. Now, arete, that's an ancient Greek concept meaning excellence or mastery of a medium. Here, it's being fused with transgressive, intimate, and often taboo storytelling. The creator isn't just trying to make a provocative image, right? They're masterfully blending raw, intense narrative tension with a very specific, almost gothic folk rock aesthetic. Think super heavy textures, dark shadows, and a mood that is equally haunting and alluring. It's basically the highest level of artistic execution applied to the most primal, illicit subject matter. Moving on to Section 2, the aesthetics of taboo, high art mastery. The source text actually asked for the perspective of a handheld 90s camcorder, but notice how the creator totally subverts that expectation. They've utilized this incredibly thick, almost impasto oil-drawn painting texture. It completely transforms the requested gritty, lo-fi camcorder perspective into a haunting, timeless piece of art. The dimly lit domestic space is rendered with these heavy, deliberate strokes, making the air in the room feel physically thick. The medium itself, the simulated oil paint, adds this immense weight and gravity to the taboo moment happening on the floor. Section 3. Duality of the subject. Microdetails and visceral emotion. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how comparing these two variations side by side reveals incredible nuances. We've seen the room, but the true anchor of this piece is obviously the subject in the foreground. If you look closely at the subtle shifts in the brushstrokes, you'll see in both versions her cheeks are deeply flushed and her wide eyes are glistening with unshed tears. Or hey, perhaps just pure adrenaline. The thick paint beautifully captures the sweat on her skin and the frantic energy in her gaze. You can literally see the conflicted pleasure and forced embarrassment fighting for dominance across her features. And that brings us to, honestly, the most fascinating part of the prompt's language, and it highlights exactly why understanding this translation from text to pixel matters so much. The text actually uses these intense, almost bizarre descriptors, LollingMonsterGutteral and SluttyTabooStruggling. I mean, how does a visual engine translate that level of aggressive abstraction? Well, we see it right here in her expression. Her mouth is open, her breath seemingly caught in her throat. Her cheeks are slightly hollowed out as she struggles with the depth of the moment. The visual output takes those extreme, almost monstrous text prompts and distills them into a deeply human expression of naughty, struggling submission. It is a masterclass in translating raw, aggressive text into palpable visual emotion. All right, Section 4, the voyeur at the door. The looming threat. Okay, to fully grasp the narrative structure, we really have to turn our attention from the foreground to the background. Look at the blurred silhouette through the frosted glass panel. The bedroom door is shut, but a man is standing there. His hand is raised as if he's mid-knock. So, who is he? Is it a partner? A stranger? The tension just skyrockets here because the source text explicitly isolates the illicit nature of this moment. The subject is locked onto the camera, locked into this act of submission, while the outside world is literally banging on the door to get in. We can understand the lighting here through this concept of implicit mystery lumina. Notice how the lighting is described as moody and domestic. The glow coming through that frosted glass isn't just illuminating the room, it's acting as a physical barrier. That lumina, that glowing light, separates the intensely private illicit moment happening inside from the looming unknown threat of the outside world pressing against the glass. The light itself is doing the heavy lifting to create the suspense. And this brilliantly illustrates the final piece of our compositional puzzle. Look at the top right of the frame. The man involved in the act is partially out of frame, but his hand is firmly planted on her head. The prompt demands his dominant presence be felt purely through the angle. And wow, we absolutely feel it. We don't even need to see his face. The aggressive angle of the shot, combined with the heavy, textured grip of his hand, tells us everything we need to know about the power dynamics at play. We're experiencing his dominance purely through the camera's perspective and his physical control over her posture. Section 5. Textures of tension. The claustrophobic psychology. So, we've got the foreground emotion and the background threat. Let's pull it all together by analyzing the contradictory elements at play here. This entire artwork is built on paradoxical emotions and contrasting dualities. We have the push and pull of naughty submission versus forced embarrassment. We have the safety of domestic lighting clashing violently with the illicit nature of the act and that looming silhouette at the door. And what binds all these extremes together is the texture. The thick, dark, filled-in nature of the oil strokes, a darker, thicker, filled approach, completely amplifies the tension. Basically, the heavier the paint, the heavier the psychological weight of the room feels to us, the viewer. Remember how the original prompt specifically asked for a slight, grainy VHS texture? Well, to execute this demand within an oil painting aesthetic, the image utilizes concepts we can think of as original, replica, exact, and reforged rhetoric refactor. It is truly incredible how it takes the idea of digital, magnetic VHS noise and refactors it into physical, tactile ridges of oil paint on a canvas. The grain isn't a digital artifact. It's baked into the very brushstrokes that make up her skin and the frosted glass. It's a marvelous translation of mediums that makes the scene feel retro, yet timelessly immediate. Which leaves us with one final, pretty haunting question to consider. With the subject looking directly into the lens, the hand forcing her down, and the silhouette knocking at the frosted glass, what is our role? Are we the voyeur holding that 90s camcorder, totally complicit in the act? Or are we simply a witness, trapped inside this claustrophobic, brilliantly textured room, caught in an unresolved loop of tension right before that door opens? It's a testament to the power of structured language and artistic execution that an image can make us feel so deeply implicated. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it leaves you with a fresh perspective on how tension is built layer by layer, word by word, and stroke by stroke.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a highly complex, intensely manufactured visual scenario. We're looking at exactly how artificial intelligence takes an illicit, highly charged text prompt and transforms it into a piece of digital art that is literally buzzing with tension. We're going to map out the anatomy of a specific scene, one we're calling Mommy Kneels When Daddy Knocks. Now, before we really get into it, I do want to note that this is an objective look at adult algorithmic generation. We're strictly examining how AI processes consensual adult kink roleplay tags. Obviously, any non-consensual or underage applications of these tools are completely unacceptable. Our focus today is purely on the technical and aesthetic deconstruction of this one specific adult scenario.
A cinematic, high-tension shot. The lighting is moody and domestic. That single, highly evocative line from our source text, that's the genesis of everything we're about to look at. It completely sets the baseline mood without being explicitly graphic, basically demanding that the AI engine produce an atmosphere dripping with narrative weight before a single character is even rendered.
Okay, let's dive into this. The AI translates that raw, atmospheric text into a highly charged visual almost instantly. Notice just how static the image is, and yet it practically vibrates with this manufactured domestic tension. The structural components here, the positioning of the figures, the physical barriers, the sheer claustrophobia of the setting, they are all mathematically calculated by the system to satisfy the prompt's demand for high-tension cinematic drama.
So we're going to break this down into 5 core areas. First, the illicit domestic trope. Second, framing the dominant POV. Third, medium, VHS meets oil. Fourth, lighting the taboo. And finally, number 5, synthesizing conflicted emotion.
All right, part 1, the illicit domestic trope. Our source text provides a surprisingly specific architectural and narrative blueprint. The requested elements include a handheld camera perspective, a dimly lit bedroom setting, a frosted glass door shut firmly in the background, and, critically, the silhouette of a man knocking on that glass. These are absolutely not random details. They're the fundamental building blocks constructed to generate a very specific psychological response. Notice how these elements interact with each other. The blurred, frosted glass door and that dark, knocking silhouette aren't just background noise. They actively frame our primary subject. The crucial point here is that the visual space is intentionally restricted. The locked door and the impending arrival of the silhouette establish an inescapable boundary, and that instantly communicates the illicit, secretive nature of the moment taking place right there in the foreground.
Moving on to part 2. Framing the dominant POV.
The man is partially out of frame, his dominant presence felt through the angle. Now, that is a fascinating constraint to give to an AI. It requires the engine to convey power and dominance not through full visibility or, a commanding facial expression, but purely through spatial relationship and composition.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the AI solved that compositional puzzle. Notice the harsh, high-angle perspective forcing us, the viewer, to look down on the subject. And look at that large, heavily textured hand entering from the top right of the frame, pressing down. It perfectly fulfills the demand for a presence that is dominant, felt entirely through angle and proximity, while keeping the rest of the figure completely out of bounds.
Part 3. Medium, VHS meets oil.
Comparing the prompt's instructions against the actual output reveals a pretty stark contradiction. The source text explicitly requested a gritty, grainy VHS texture, like mimicking a 90s camcorder. But somewhere in the generation pipeline, classical art style modifiers were applied, specifically tags like darker, thicker filled and oil-drawn painting. So the AI had to synthesize the gritty, lo-fi narrative context of a camcorder recording with the heavy, classical rendering of fine art. The result of that bizarre synthesis is a technique known as impasto. Impasto is basically a method where paint is laid onto a surface so thickly that the three-dimensional brush or painting knife strokes become entirely visible. Instead of flat digital VHS grain, the AI interpreted the demand for texture entirely through this classical lens.
Just look at the incredibly heavy, thick texture on the woman's ruffled clothing, the strands of her hair, and the wooden frame of the door. The digital grain is totally gone, replaced by these visceral, three-dimensional strokes. It creates a jarring but honestly compelling juxtaposition. It's a modern, illicit, voyeuristic scenario rendered with the painstaking, tactile weight of a classical oil canvas.
Which brings us to part 4, lighting the taboo. The prompt gave a very clear directive here. It literally stated, the lighting is moody and domestic, focusing on the illicit nature of the moment. The AI had to use light not just to make things visible, but as a highlighter for the taboo itself. Look at the localized intensity of the directional lighting here. It falls almost exclusively on the subject's face and upper chest, illuminating her flushed skin with this warm, intimate glow. Meanwhile, the background, specifically that silhouette at the door, is kept in stark, shadowy contrast. This lighting scheme literally forces our eye away from the impending threat at the door and down to the vulnerable subject. It isolates her within a spotlight of tension.
Let's move to and see how this builds into our 5th and final section, synthesizing conflicted emotion. Now this is where the mechanics of AI art generation get genuinely surreal. Look at the language used in the prompt to generate human expression. We have these bizarre, chaotic AI prompt tags like LollingMonsterGutteral and SluttyTabooStruggling. I mean, it sounds like absolute nonsense to the human ear, right? But to the machine learning model, this highly specific, albeit ridiculous syntax translates into incredibly precise emotional outputs, a mix of conflicted pleasure, forced embarrassment, and submission. And remarkably, it actually works. The AI consistently manages to render these complex, diametrically opposed emotions simultaneously on the subject's face. You've got fear, surprise, submission, and a manufactured sense of pleasure, all competing for dominance in a single static expression.
The prompt's final mandate was exactly that, focusing on the raw emotion of the woman's face. This instruction tightly funnels all the surrounding environmental tension, the knocking man, the dominant hand, the claustrophobic lighting, directly into the absolute center of the canvas.
What's really interesting about this slide is the peak emotional resonance achieved by combining everything we've just discussed. Linger on those wide, glistening eyes and the slightly hollowed cheeks. The thick impasto texture gives a physical weight to her flushed skin, while the severe high-angle framing and stark lighting trap her in this frozen moment of duality. It's the absolute focal point of the manufactured tension. Which leaves us with a really compelling question to consider. We've seen how clinical architectural prompts, bizarre algorithmic language, and forced perspectives are all layered together. But when these raw, explicitly taboo prompts are filtered through the sophisticated aesthetic modifiers of classical oil painting, does the resulting visual tension elevate the illicit into the realm of high art, or does it merely dress a voyeuristic impulse in a thicker coat of paint? It is a fascinating intersection of human intent, artificial interpretation, and classical aesthetics. Thanks for exploring this explainer with me today. Keep questioning what you see.
Welcome to this explainer. We're jumping straight into something totally fascinating today. We're going to dive deep into the actual mechanics of visual tension by analytically deconstructing a highly specific and honestly pretty provocative digital art trope. The piece we're exploring is driven by a conceptual prompt titled "Mommy Kneels When Daddy Knocks." Now, regardless of the taboo nature of the subject matter here, what we're really interested in is the architecture of the image itself. Like, how do you construct a scene that immediately makes the viewer's heart race? How exactly does an algorithm interpret human tension? Well, let's find out.
So, the foundation of literally any AI-generated image is its prompt, right? And the source text for this scene kicks off with a super specific instruction. A cinematic, high-tension shot captured from the perspective of a handheld 90s camcorder. We're going to examine the specific text prompts and the artistic styles used to generate this imagery. Because by looking at these raw instructions, we can really start to understand how composition and very specific word choices get synthesized by an algorithm to create a visceral, deeply suspenseful narrative on screen. When you break down the source material, it all really comes down to these 3 structural elements working together: a closed door, a dominant hand, a conflicted gaze. These 3 pillars are exactly what craft the illicit and intensely claustrophobic atmosphere of the piece. If you take away even one of these elements, the whole psychological house of cards just completely collapses. They're basically the load-bearing walls of this entire visual thriller. And just look at the raw impact of this single moment. Let's sit with the visceral feel of this scene for a second. The whole thing centers entirely on the kneeling subject and the unseen forces acting on her. You'll notice your eyes instantly drawn to her face, but almost immediately after you feel the weight of the hand on her head and then that looming shadow in the background. It's a frozen moment, sure, but it implies a massive amount of kinetic energy and impending action.
Okay, moving into Section 1, Anatomy of a Taboo Scene.
To figure out why this builds suspense so effectively, we've got to peel back the layers and look at what we can call the spatial mapping of suspense. The composition brilliantly traps the subject between three distinct points of spatial tension. First, you've got the subject positioned below. Second, the dominant hand and the point of view are positioned above. And third, you have that unknowing intruder looming right behind. It creates this literal triangle of tension, isolating the woman completely in the dead center of the frame and the narrative. You can actually see how clearly the character positioning maps out that spatial tension we were just talking about. Look at the downward pressure there. The dominant hand physically forces your eye downward toward the subject, acting like a visual weight. But at the exact same time, that looming background element, the figure at the frosted glass, threatens to shatter the intimacy of the foreground at any second. So you have this intense downward pressure colliding with a background intrusion, and it just creates incredible claustrophobia.
All right, that brings us to Section 2, Conflicted Emotions and Expressions.
Moving past the spatial mapping, let's really zoom in on the subject herself, because ultimately her highly detailed facial expressions are the true anchor of this domestic thriller. Check out the subtle differences across these variations. Look at the flushed cheeks, look at the wide, glistening eyes. The source prompt actually uses some incredibly bizarre, hyper-specific language to pull this off, commanding a look that is LollingMonsterGutteral with slightly hollowed cheeks as she struggles. It's absolutely fascinating how these abstract, almost nonsensical strings of algorithmic text translate into such hyper-specific human emotions. It's a sheer collision of panic and submission. Actually, the source text mandates this exact emotional synthesis using a really specific piece of jargon, SluttyTabooStruggling. Now, as an algorithmic aesthetic descriptor, this tag doesn't function like normal human conversation. Instead, it acts as a very strict set of coordinates for the AI. It essentially forces the algorithm to blend a highly specific mix of quote-unquote naughty submission, conflicted pleasure, and forced embarrassment right into the final render. It's literally engineering human emotion through raw code words.
Section 3. The Unseen Dominant POV. So now that we understand the subject, how are we, the audience, brought into this? The actual framing of the image is explicitly designed to implicate the observer. The guy in the foreground is mostly out of frame. All we really get is a hand and a forearm, but his dominant presence is heavily felt through that extreme downward angle. By cropping him out, the prompt is putting you, the viewer, directly into the first-person perspective. You are looking through the lens of that 90s camcorder mentioned back in the source text.
And there's a very specific purpose for that, which is highlighted by this line straight from the source prompt, focusing on the raw emotion of the woman's face and the illicit nature of the moment. This first-person perspective isn't just a fun artistic choice, It acts as a structural tool. It forces a deeply claustrophobic focus purely on the woman's raw emotion. You literally can't look away from her face because the camera angle physically traps your gaze exactly where the unseen dominant figure is looking.
Which sets us up for Section 4, the threat at the door.
But the real ticking clock of the scene isn't in the foreground at all. The foreground is static. The dynamic tension lives right there behind the subject. In that blurred, moody background, the bedroom door is shut. But right there, through the frosted glass panel, a man's silhouette is starkly visible. He's posed exactly as if he's in the middle of knocking. And he is completely blissfully unaware of the highly charged, illicit scene happening mere inches away on the other side of the glass.
If you check out these variations, you can see how this looming intruder creates an intense sense of impending climax. The visual distance between the subject's fearful gaze and the guy at the door is just agonizingly short. That silhouette is constantly threatening to break through the domestic, moody lighting and totally expose the taboo scene. It's essentially the classic Hitchcockian bomb under the table, right? We know the threat is there, the subject knows the threat is there, but the threat itself is entirely oblivious.
And finally, Section 5, Thick Oils and VHS Grime.
To really wrap our heads around this explainer, we've got to deconstruct the completely paradoxical visual style that brings this whole psychological tension to life. It's almost mind-boggling when you think about it. The prompt asks the algorithm for this incredible visual paradox. On one hand, it demands the gritty, lo-fi texture of a 90s VHS camcorder, all digital grime and home video voyeurism. But on the other hand, it utilizes tags that command a heavy, physical presence, much more akin to a classical oil painting. It's this baffling but honestly brilliant collision of cheap digital recording and fine art rendering. Driven by algorithmic styles like darker, thicker filled, this aesthetic manifests in incredibly heavy shadows.
Notice the thick, almost sculpted, glistening textures on the woman's face, and look at the rough, almost impasto-like quality of the door frame and the guy's shirt in reflection. It looks wet, it looks heavy, and it feels undeniably physical.
To nail that exact vibe, the source material relies on this string of totally esoteric AI tags: enchant, quanta, arita, darker, thicker filled, oil-drawn painting, reforged rhetoric refactor. These exact algorithmic enhancement tags combine to essentially translate a raw, potentially sleazy digital grime concept into an almost classical, heavy oil composition. It drastically elevates the scene's emotional weight, making the whole thing feel simultaneously ancient and yet uncomfortably modern.
Which leaves us with a truly fascinating question to close out this explainer. Does this clash of a modern, voyeuristic camcorder aesthetic with the timeless gravity of an oil painting make the psychological tension more or less real to the observer? By dressing a 90s home video trope in the heavy textures of classical art, the algorithm forces us to look at a fleeting, taboo moment as if it were a permanent historical artifact. It really is a masterclass in how words, spatial tension, and algorithmic styles can manipulate our gaze. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning what you see out there.
Welcome back, focus learners, to another explainer. We've got a truly fascinating structural analysis ahead of us today. We're going to completely deconstruct exactly how artificial intelligence takes incredibly complex, totally contradictory human emotions and highly specific narrative tension and translates all of that into a single cohesive image. We are taking a deep dive into an absolutely intricate prompt. I mean, this is basically a piece of digital cinematography. We're going to figure out how a machine interprets illicit tension, physical positioning, and environmental storytelling. So, let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this. Just take a moment to really look at the striking emotional intensity captured here. I mean, we are immediately thrown into a super high-stakes scenario. The visual texture is incredibly dense, sure, but what actually grabs you is that raw, almost overwhelming tension in the subject's face. You see the upward gaze, the wide eyes, the obvious physical constraint implied by that hand gripping her hair. It literally screams narrative pressure. But remember, this wasn't painted by a human hand over months in some studio. No way. This was birthed entirely from a block of text. And here is the very beginning of that exact text, basically our director's script for today's visual deconstruction. The prompt kicks things off by demanding a cinematic, high-tension shot captured from the perspective of a handheld 90s camcorder. Right out of the gate, you have to realize the AI isn't just being asked to draw a person. It's being handed a camera, a specific lens, a distinct time period, and an emotional baseline. It's literally being told to become a cinematographer before it even picks up a digital brush. Section 1. The director's prompt. Let's look at the macro instructions. So the AI was fed this wildly complex, honestly contradictory set of directives that it had to somehow balance. The setting? A dimly lit bedroom. The required emotion is basically a paradox, conflicted pleasure and forced embarrassment. It specifically calls for physical reactions like wide, glistening eyes. And then, and this is where it gets crazy, it uses these highly specialized algorithmic modifier tags, things like LollingMonsterGutteral for the mouth and SluttyTabooStruggling to dictate the precise flavor of submission. You know, these aren't your standard English adjectives. These are highly targeted machine learning triggers, specifically designed to force the AI to mash up intense physiological and psychological states. What's absolutely captivating about the result here is how the AI decided to render the actual medium. The prompt explicitly asked for a grainy VHS texture. But rather than just spitting out flat, pixelated digital static, the AI translated that requested physical noise into this magnificent, thick, impasto oil painting aesthetic. Look at the literal ridges and valleys of the paint on her skin and the doorframe. The machine essentially interpreted the gritty, analog imperfection of an old VHS tape as the raised, heavy brushstrokes of a dark, brooding physical canvas. It's brilliant. Section 2. Staging the handheld perspective. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive difference between standard framing and aggressive narrative framing. You know, in traditional portraiture, the camera's usually parked right at eye level, flattering the subject, keeping all the proportions nice and neutral. But this prompt, it demanded a handheld POV from above. This totally forces the AI to render a high angle looking down. The text explicitly notes that she has to struggle with the depth, which forces her to crane her neck up. That creates those slightly hollowed cheeks and physically stretches the anatomy to convey intense vulnerability to whoever is holding that unseen camera. Now direct your attention right up to the top right of the frame. See that large, heavy hand gripping the subject's hair? The prompt gave a very specific instruction. The man is partially out of frame, his dominant presence felt through the angle. And the AI executes this flawlessly. By keeping the actual body of this figure completely off screen and only showing the hand applying that downward pressure, the image forces us, the viewers, to fill in the blanks. That dominant presence is entirely implied, which honestly makes it feel so much more invasive and intimate. So what we're really learning here is a core rule of visual storytelling: tension through framing. A lot of times, what is deliberately left entirely out of the frame creates the absolute most narrative pressure. The threat or the dominance you can't fully see, that's always going to be way more compelling than the one perfectly centered in the light. Section 3. Crafting conflicted expressions. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the AI plays with these incredibly subtle variations across different generation attempts. On the left and the right, we fed it the exact same prompt, but we got slightly different interpretations of the subject's face. The AI is actively trying to balance conflicted pleasure with forced embarrassment. Notice the tiny shifts in the furrow of the brow, how wide those glistening eyes are, the exact shape of the open, struggling mouth. It's literally calculating pixel by pixel how much space to dedicate to fear versus submission. Let's just read the exact text constraint driving this one more time. Her cheeks slightly hollowed as she struggles with the depth. Her expression a mix of naughty submission and slutty taboo struggling. Keep in mind, the machine doesn't actually know what these words mean emotionally. It has no feelings. It has to force physiological details like flushed, reddened skin, dilated pupils, strained neck muscles to objectively convey a highly subjective, illicit emotion to a human viewer. Section 4. The implied background narrative. Focus your eye on the silhouette visible through the frosted glass over on the left. The prompt instructed, in the blurred background, the bedroom door is shut and the silhouette of a man is visible through the frosted glass panel of the door, as if knocking. And boom, this is where the core theme of our explainer, Mommy Kneels When Daddy Knocks, comes into razor-sharp focus. The AI uses that moody, domestic lighting to cast this dark, looming shadow. The raised hand of the silhouette indicates the exact moment of a knock. That one single background element completely shifts the entire context, from a private, contained moment into one of imminent discovery and absolute dread. Which brings us nicely to the concept of the illicit gaze. This background element fundamentally elevates the image. It takes it from a simple character study and turns it into a high-stakes cinematic moment. There are actually 3 layers of viewing happening all at once here. You've got the subject looking up at the dominant camera holder, you have us, the audience, viewing the entire scene, and then you have the looming threat of the man at the door about to completely shatter that isolation. Section 5. Comparing the visual variations. Looking at this breakdown, we can really grade the AI's balancing act. Some of these iterations prioritize that thick, impasto oil texture, but they end up sacrificing a bit of the photorealistic facial tension to get it. Other variations make the frosted glass silhouette super defined, while some just leave it as this terrifying, ambiguous blur. The AI is constantly having to negotiate between the physical weight of the painted simulating and the precise physiological cues demanded by those extreme emotion tags. Let's move to and see how this builds in these 2 specific versions. Notice how the thick impasto texture interacts with the requested VHS grain here. In the image on the left, the heavy paint strokes on the woman's chest and shoulders create this intense feeling of being physically weighed down, which perfectly matches the narrative of submission. On the right, the texture on the frosted glass makes the silhouette feel even more distorted and menacing. The stylistic choice the machine made is directly enhancing the psychological dread requested by the text. And that brings us to this specific generation, which honestly serves as an absolute masterclass in prompt adherence. Every single variable converges perfectly here. The knocking silhouette is ominous, but it's perfectly diffused by the glass. The gripping hand is authoritative and completely anchors that high-angle perspective. And the subject's face is just a flawless, incredibly complex map of forced embarrassment, flushed skin, and glistening, wide-eyed tension. The AI took this chaotic list of illicit desires and cinematic directions and somehow organized the whole shebang into a unified, striking piece of visual art. So the crucial point is that prompt engineering is no longer just about, asking for a picture of an object. It's a highly technical, completely objective exercise in how machines process complex human desires, psychological states, and spatial awareness into structured visual storytelling. You aren't just typing. You're directing a digital actor on a digital set. Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on.
If an AI can stage human tension, illicit narratives, and implied off-screen threats this precisely from just a mere paragraph of text today, what exactly happens when our cinematic prompts become even more complex tomorrow? Thank you so much for joining me on this Explainer Focus, learners. Keep dissecting those details, and I'll see you in the next one.